Thank you so much, Jen. We're really appreciative to have this opportunity, not just to join as we look forward to every month the APSG meetings, but also to share our work. I'd like to give a special note of thanks to Jim, to Ilhan, to Lisa, who were a part of shepherding the process of this paper as we wrote it this summer. And with that, bear with me for a second while I share our screen. All right, thumbs up, Ernesto. Can you see the screen? Excellent. All right, so you always worry when you're presenting a tech-centric paper that your tech is going to fail, but it looks like we're off and running. So we are speaking today on social media misinformation and the prevention of both mass atrocities and then wider political instability. We'll speak a little bit about how we conceptualize the project as we begin these remarks. But it is my job to kick us off with what were the overall findings of this paper. So we do start off in this paper with outlining the key conditions that exacerbate social media misinformation resonance, as we call it, the things that stick. We also talk about its main functions and the effects of social media misinformation, as well as examining the challenges for instability and the atrocity prevention community in countering it. There's really the rub, not just to identify the problem, but how do we solve it? And what we really come down to is that solving these problems involve a kind of intricate connection of networks, of puzzle pieces that can't really fully be broken apart, that there are different stakeholder communities that all have a say in both either perpetuating these problems, but also solving them. So in our broader paper, we provide policy recommendations for these different stakeholder groups, based off of the recommendations of so many people being willing to speak with us in each of these representative fields. So not only having these candid conversations where we would say, what would you suggest to your field or to your colleagues in the field, but also what do you have to say to your colleagues in a field adjacent? And so our paper tries to pull all of these things together in a constructive way by offering these recommendations for social media corporations and organizations, for legacy media, for established media, and providing that sort of foundation of facts that then shape these conversations in profound ways when emergencies or atrocities unfold. We also give recommendations for civil society organizations who do work in this area, for researchers who do work in this area. And then where we're really going to focus our discussion today at the end of our presentation is the recommendations that we tailor to government and multilateral organizations. So you might have heard that we have been saying social media misinformation instead of just social media disinformation. It's often a companion term, even though it's a distinct concept. And to talk a little bit about why and how we conceptualize these concepts that our paper deals with, I'm going to turn it over to Ernesto now.
Great, thank you, Christina. And as Christina said, thank you all for joining us today, and especially to the people who helped organize this, as well as Rachel for being a discussant. We greatly appreciate it. So just a few terms in a sense of kind of how we're approaching this project. By social media, we mean computer-based platforms that enable people to communicate and share information in essentially near real time or in real time. And we draw a distinction for the purposes of this study between social media misinformation and social media disinformation. The first, social media misinformation, involves false or misleading information shared across these platforms. So essentially anything that's false or misleading, regardless of intentionality. People often share misinformation because they actually believe in the truth of what they're sharing. So that category kind of captures the whole range, or the whole continuum of different types of false or misleading information. Social media disinformation, in keeping with much of the literature and the way researchers normally think of this, refers to the subset of intentionally shared misinformation. So this is where you hear about things like disinformation campaigns, or as we note here on the slide as well, so-called influence operations, which are sustained campaigns, usually organized by states or parastatal entities, but not exclusively so, that deal with these types of questions and really kind of advance these issues for their own particular interests. I want to say a little bit about kind of given these basic terms, and as we go forth, we're going to draw distinctions about the applicability of focusing on social media misinformation versus disinformation. There's enormous variation here in terms of context and circumstances and how to respond to these questions. But this gives you a sense of the general terms. I also want to say a little bit about basically the method or methodology undergirding all of this. So very, very briefly, we talk about this in the study as well. Our paper is based not only on extant scholarly and practitioner research, but it's also based on a little over 100 interviews that Christina and I did with folks in media, folks in the tech industry, in legacy media, in corporations that deal with these questions, civil society organizations, monitoring groups, and also government and non-governmental organizations. So it's a wide swath of folks. And I should add that we also spoke to a lot of computer scientists. So that's kind of an important cluster of sources of information that we got for the purposes of this project. And then lastly, some of the findings here, some of the points that we make also draw on a project that Christine and I are working on with some other computer scientists on using artificial intelligence algorithms to understand visual social media disinformation and misinformation patterns with a focus on Ukraine. We won't talk about that case for the purposes of this project. If you want to talk about it during the Q&A, we're happy to discuss it. So let me say just a kind of a few things here, and then I'll hand it over to Christina. I want to say a little bit about when we're talking about misinformation, and I should say that we're using social media misinformation as the master category to talk about the general phenomena, that we draw distinctions on disinfo and whatnot. But when we're talking about this, I wanted to start off first by talking about the broader factors that increase the resonance of misinformation, broadly understood. And very briefly, these include one cluster of factors, which are socio-political cleavages, so such as severe social and political polarization, or governance and security crisis. That's one cluster of factors that increase the resonance of this kind of misinformation. Secondly, there are profound socio-psychological dynamics at play. Some of you may be familiar with some of this, but the research is actually becoming more and more sophisticated on these questions. And by social psychological dynamics, I refer particularly to a need that most people have for belonging and a sense of security by being part of something bigger than themselves. So misinformation can amplify that by emphasizing in-group and out-group distinctions. Secondly, another dynamic that's important is the question of intelligibility. That is the tendency among human beings to make sense of extremely complex things by reducing them to relatively simple cause and effect dynamics. Misinformation, when it's done effectively, often gives simple answers to complex questions. This is kind of how conspiracy thinking particularly works. And then thirdly, confirmation bias, which is the tendency to reaffirm biases we already have and kind of emphasize those things. So it reinforces this sense that what we're seeing is in line or in harmony with our pre-existing beliefs. So that's psychological dynamics. And then two other important factors, clusters of factors that emphasize or that really factors. One is social media factors. And by that, we mean the existence of a robust social media ecosystem. So some countries are more sophisticated at this than others. This is why we're working on Ukraine, which has a very sophisticated social media ecosystem. A lot of people involved in social media. But secondly, and related to this is the presence of an attention economy. And this is something that people who work on social media and psychologists who work in this area tend to emphasize. The idea of an attention economy is the recognition that all human beings have limited attention. We have a kind of a limited bandwidth of how much attention we can give to any set of issues or of questions in a given day. And so the attention economy is a way of developing mechanisms so that people are more involved in social media by finding different ways that draw their attention, kind of maintain their attention on social media. This is at the center of how these big tech corporations operate. This is how they make their money, through advertising, but nevertheless, it can have really deleterious effects for the spread of misinformation. Lastly, another kind of cluster of factors that increase the resonance of misinformation include what we refer to as high political valence topics. And by that, we mean highly salient and divisive issues or topics that are occurring in society, like an upcoming election. High political valence topics tend to be particularly problematic under conditions where there's already kind of a high-risk country with significant political cleavages, et cetera, but especially if there are uncertain outcomes on this particular topic that rely on some degree of public support. So I can say more about all of these, but it gives you a sense of the broader conditions that help amplify the resonance of social media misinformation. The fact is that social media misinformation works more effectively in some circumstances and contexts than others. So this is a way of nesting it within those broader factors. Over to you, Christina.
Great. Thank you so much, Ernesto. So as we were sort of grappling with all of these factors that Ernesto has laid out, we just wanted to highlight and sort of re-emphasize three different functions that social media misinformation can play, and the sort of inherent factors that are, again, clustered underneath all of these topics. We do go into more detail on this, particularly the information on this slide in our paper. So if you're interested, we would invite you to access our paper through the Simpson Center. But the first thing that we looked at is how social media misinformation can increase outgroup vulnerability. And so some of the clustered issues that we look at there are the ways that it can fray social relations, the way that it can spread dehumanizing or polarizing discourse, and then the way that social media misinformation spreads false accusations against an opponent. And in so doing, related functions there are how it dissuades public deliberation and how it curtails speech through both just not the kind of structural factors that we associate with authoritarian regimes, but even through things like self-censoring or hate campaigns spread online. And then kind of related to that, the people doing that, social media misinformation can be very, can have this resonance that we keep talking about because it increases in-group cohesion. And this is really related to the psychological dynamics that Ernesto has just gone over. But it's things, again, that it has this group affirming function, that it can build collective identity around perceptions of persecution. And as these perceptions of persecution are tied into people's sense of self, their sense of community, there can be this snowball effect where it can advocate for collective self-defense or for what would be considered preemptive attacks against a perceived enemy. So an enemy, real or perceived, a perceived enemy, these violence seen not just as reactive, but then preemptive. That becomes very dangerous. And that can be a role that social media misinformation really has a lot of resonance for our field. And so we also wanted to highlight, and we do so in the paper, the work of social media misinformation and not just escalating these dynamics, but also in serving as a platform for the practical work of organizing collective action offline. That is also, again, tied into these perceptions of in-group cohesion. And then finally, the function of social media misinformation that we talk about in the paper is related to the way that it just erodes civil trust. And this is something that we talk about in the language of spreading epistemic insecurity. So there are a couple of different factors clustered under this topic, but we talk about how social media misinformation is part of a larger diversionary effort usually. Jen mentioned at the beginning of our talk some of the disinformation, the way that it's grown since the days of Bosnia. So this part of a diversionary effect, the social media misinformation is connected to larger dynamics. It can also spread doubt on issues like electoral fairness. And then again, as I said, this larger cluster that we call epistemic insecurity, and this is where charges of bias, assimilation, and conspiracy undermine truth claims. And in so doing, they undermine these evaluative standards, they undermine the evidentiary standards for determining things like what is a fact, and they're replaced by unsubstantiated alternative narratives that are then perceived as having equal weight. So again, these functions of social media misinformation, they're all kind of related, but we really view these functions of social media misinformation as then spilling over into some of the challenges that we as a field face in countering it. So I'll turn it over to Ernesto now to talk about those. Oh, Ernesto, muted.
Thank you. So broadly speaking, we identify a cluster of general challenges for the instability and atrocity prevention community. The paper itself was written at a level of kind of 30,000 feet. So looking over the big clusters and the big general types of questions and challenges. Again, in the Q&A, in the discussion, we can dive in and think about particular cases and how we might think this through. But looking at it from this perspective, we identify kind of a cluster of these different types of challenges. The first is the question of speed, the diffusion of misinformation. It's this particular challenge because of the ways in which the speed of misinformation effectively concentrates and amplifies confirmation biases, right? It works faster than the ability very often of people to respond and try to subvert or try to counter this type of messaging. So there's just a natural question of speed. Secondly, there's a question of chaos, something that we were talking about before the presentation with Jim, which is just frankly the overabundance of information. There's an enormous amounts of information, especially misinformation, disinformation being produced, and it's very difficult to tackle all of this from the perspective of a prevention community in real time. So it can be done with higher profile questions and really high profile issues, but in general, it spreads at a very quick rate, and it's an enormous amount of material being produced. Thirdly, there's a cluster of questions and concerns and challenges around curation and control. And what we mean by that is social media, all social media information, including misinformation, disinformation, is partly a function or it's partly shaped through the interactions of all sorts of third parties, from the people who develop the algorithms to the people who run the social media platforms, to the different types of actors that produce material and then disseminate it to their networks. But the point is that for the purposes of misinformation and specifically for disinformation, there can be a strategic dissemination of SMD, of disinformation, during particularly politically sensitive moments. You see this, for instance, with false accusations of imminent violence. It's very hard to respond to this in real time with information that has been doctored or manipulated that helps exacerbate instability in a particular case. So we have situations of curation and control. This is an additional kind of challenge where the atrocity prevention community sometimes, and this includes civil society actors and others, is sometimes on its heels a little bit. Fourthly, there's a question of capacity and anonymity, another major challenge, and this is simply the fact that the technology has become increasingly affordable and easy to use, and it's also relatively easy to hide the provenance of the production of disinformation. Not in all cases, but one of the things that really struck us in talking to computer science experts, including the people we work with, but not exclusively them, is the ease with which it is to hide, it's possible to hide the provenance of misinformation, disinformation. So it can be a little bit hard to kind of trace that back. Again, not in all circumstances, but it raises profound challenges for trying to get to the source issue. So this is a particular challenge. I should add, just as an aside, and we talk about this in the report a little bit, the other side of the coin, so to speak, is that this can be good for anonymous peace building efforts and accountability efforts as well. It can protect peace builders under some circumstances if they have the right technological protection. Last two categories that come up here in challenges is one around speech rights. This is the question of balancing civil liberties and civilian protection. This is often a challenge for big tech corporations, though it differs by the corporation. There's a difference when we're talking about Meta, Twitter, perhaps Alphabet, YouTube, versus talking about Telegram, and certainly perhaps about Gab and some of these other corporations. TikTok is a new player in terms of its influence. It's increasing rapidly, and they represent a particular interesting set of challenges. But the point is, the question here, the challenge is, how does one balance, how does think of balancing the issue of civil liberties with the issue of civilian protection, protection of rights in vulnerable populations? It's a particular challenge. I think big tech corporations would often tell us it's challenging when they're operating in multiple different jurisdictions and they're trying to satisfy the jurisdictional demands of the legal systems across those cases. After all, for the most part, these are global corporations. And then lastly, there's the question of censorship and accountability. How do we balance the issue of pursuing and trying to stop misinformation and disinformation with the rights of human right of sharing information and of freedom of speech, particularly from a governmental perspective? You've all probably seen the recent legislation in Turkey, which is ramping up the kinds of punishments for people being accused of disinformation. It looks pretty bad. So there are profound kind of questions there. We kind of explore this throughout the paper. But what I want to say here is essentially that the fight against misinformation and disinformation can also provide cover for state repression, and it can also come up against the question of lack of uniformity across jurisdictions. So it can be kind of challenged along those lines. And I will go on to the next screen. I think I have the next one, and then I pass it over to Christina for the last two. So the report itself lays out a cluster of different types of policy recommendations. We cluster them kind of by different types of actors or audiences to whom we're speaking. These include social media corporations, established or legacy media, non-governmental civil society actors that can play really important roles, not only in mobilization, but also in fact-checking and things like that. We also identify the role of researchers and other types of civil society groups that focus more on research. And then lastly, governments and multilateral organizations. I want to emphasize just one point here, and then I'll pass it on to Christina. Many of the recommendations we identify really emphasize the importance of creating alliances or building up stronger relations among different types of actors. This is not something that should be siloed. There's a lot of leverage here that can be mobilized for the purposes of trying to deal with these questions if it goes across different types of actors. We can say more about that in the Q&A, but Christina's going to talk particularly about the last category, given the audience that we have here.
Great, thank you, Ernesto. So Yeah, just again, I think, whenever you set out and do these big interviewing projects like Ernesto and I did, speaking with more than 100 people, there are always these themes that emerge. And I think Ernesto was hitting one of the themes that also emerged for me, which was the amount of people that you need to speak with to address this issue, the amount of clustering and interlinking between what's going on psychologically with people, what's going on politically in their ecosystem, and then also the people that are needed to solve it. It really is a network approach to understanding this issue, to understanding the challenges there. And then I would say also understanding the opportunities that we have for prevention, just like Ernesto was talking about. So we are going to speak really about these policy recommendations for governments and multilateral organizations. We know our audience, we know we have a lot of policy and policy adjacent people, but we would really encourage even if you to take a look at the report online and to read through the recommendations for the fields that are not your own, to think about maybe if there are leverage points in these kind of partnerships and collaborations that can be built. But for the specific recommendations that we make for governments and multilateral organizations, these are text-heavy slides because we have the full recommendations up. But I think it's worth going through, and we hope that we'll get some questions for the Q&A about these recommendations. But we talk about how important it is to develop and to strengthen these internal social media misinformation analytic capabilities. So there are several different parts there. So that's about detection, it's about classifying them, what are we looking at, what are the different types of risks that we're looking at, and then also these difficult questions of tracing it back. So working to build that internal SMM analytic capability within governments, within multilateral organizations. I don't have to preach to this choir, but we know that we really need to have these staff expertise and these bureaucratic processes expertise well established in advance of any crisis emerging. And so to do so, we encourage further work with academic experts. So about integrating SMM into early warning and accountability policy frameworks and toolkits. We also mentioned, and I think we have this on the slide maybe next, but to do so will also involve, we think, a little bit of specific case study research. So one of the challenges that we talk about in the paper that I don't think we've mentioned so far is that disinformation, as one of our interviewees said, is not a wholly portable topic. So what resonates in a particular context is going to be very different here than there. So there are these broad themes that we can talk about on the topic of social media misinformation, but it requires a lot of case study specific knowledge as well. So tapping into those case study specific experts to do these type of deep case studies that can then be compared across different contexts. Doing so, this is now at the third bullet point, but increasing this policy analyst and policymaker knowledge of social media operations. One of the parallel recommendations that we have for academics is talking more to policymakers to learn more about what these needs might be and then to do tailored research. But that also involves a process back on the policy end, so increasing this knowledge within the system. We also talk about ways to utilize global and regional organization and platforms. So we've got some listed here, but again, it's about this integration. So integrating this analysis into prevention networks, policies, and doctrines. So those are long processes. Those are processes that involve a lot of debate within the system, within the buildings. And so doing so now, so not just the networks of people doing it, but again, within policies, within doctrines, within trainings that people would do, such as at the U.S. Foreign Service Institute. We also speak to intergovernmental agencies and the role there. They are crucial in coordinating and sharing this knowledge on standards, policies, and practical tools within the system writ large, so that there's not just a particular strength in country A regarding social media misinformation, but really something that's spread within different types of governments at work in these issues. We also talk about how important it is to clarify the institutional roles and the policies internally and with civil society partners for countering social media misinformation within prevention networks, again, policies and doctrines. So this is currently very ad hoc, and because of that, there's a lot of redundancies. So are there quiet conversations that you can have with civil society partners at crucial moments to just sort of talk about this? And again, I'll mention this, it's a recommendation for our civil society friends who work on it, but we mentioned things like hosting tabletop organizations that give these opportunities for people from these different fields to get together, to get to know the challenges and limitations of others in the field, so that these roles and these policies and what other people are doing, what they can't do, what they can do, is clarified a little bit more for policy makers. This is our final slide here. But a few of the other things that we mention is examining internally and then within government and multilateral counterparts, whether terms, concepts, and mandates are similar or work at cross purposes. We've seen a lot within the atrocity prevention field in terms of even going back to the early days of defining what mass atrocities were before we had the UN framework that takes that question on. There were a lot of conversations about what these concepts meant. And there is, I think, speaking from my own experience, but there is a tendency sometimes to approach a particular policy relevant topic from the lens of what you as a policymaker are doing. So if you are working on atrocities and you're working on prosecution, you sort of look at it with a legal lens, and that can even color how you look at the concept of what it is. So having these conversations internally to say, what are we looking at? Do we all in our different bureaus, offices, institutes, and then also with our partner governments, are we all talking about the same thing? Or are there are these hidden differences that are making us work at cross purposes because we're using the same language, but talking about different concepts? Finally, kind of switching gears a little bit, we talk about government, not just in the executive branch functions, but also with legislation and with international agreements. So a couple things here, but talking about ways to standardize protocols, guidelines, and accountability. We give some specific examples in the report that we hope will be useful for people to take a look at. But related here is, again, ensuring that mechanisms to share relevant information with researchers are there. I think that there's a lot of desire within academia to do policy relevant research, but that involves understanding what that starting place is. So talking about these challenges that are present with regarding sharing information around these sensitive topics. And then again with legislation, so not only that, but looking at legislation to establish accountability or oversight mechanisms that are directly tied into incitement. There are legal issues here. And so what we do is we cite things in the report like the EU Digital Services Act. We hope that there will be future conversations around that type of legislation and how it might work in different societies, how it might need to be adapted for different cultural or political variation, but to consider that type of legislation and to have a more active legislative role or conversation going on there. And then nearing the end here, but we also talk about government and multilateral organizations and how they can assist social media organizations to protect local content moderators. And this is a kind of power differential that I personally hadn't thought of before these interviews. So, we would talk with tech companies and they are perceived by many in the field to have an inordinate share of power. They are, or some of them are hugely profitable, have the amount of profit equal to the GDP of certain countries. And so we sort of look at tech companies and perceive them as very powerful. One thing that was communicated to us by people working in those tech companies is that their power isn't universal. And one thing that they struggle with is this feeling of hiring local content moderators, but having the ability to protect them if these local content moderators are working in an authoritarian context. And it was communicated that, that's a role for governments to play. So for, an embassy in a certain context to communicate that certain local content moderators that they're aware of if those people are being targeted, things like that. There are governmental functions there that are really important and that private companies can't play. And then finally, just this danger of prioritizing policy process over outcome. We could bring that up on almost every topic, but it is certainly relevant to social media misinformation as well. So not just having, task force or things like that for it, but really being clear about the concept that everyone's working towards, the goal, and then also how is that outcome going to be measured? So those conversations as well. And with that, we are nearing the end of our report. I'll leave this slide up for a minute. We'd love to have people read the report and reach out to us. Again, we really want to thank the Atrocity Prevention Study Group and the broader Protecting Civilians and Human Securities program at the Stimson Center for giving us the opportunity to write this paper and to speak today. Ernesto, any other final comments from you?
No, I suspect that the Q&A will be interesting. So let's open up the conversation. Thank you.
Great.
Okay, Rachel, we're going to turn the floor over to you.
Wonderful. So I'm lucky enough to have the ask today to respond to this paper, and just want to start by really saying thank you, Christina and Ernesto, for this incredibly important work. And if you're on the call and you haven't actually read through the paper, I just want to make an extra plug for it. It's really easy to navigate. It's really well organized, and it takes a lot of these really complex topics and I think puts them into frameworks that can be really useful, which actually transitions into the first set of things that I wanted to talk about, which is that I actually think, in addition to all of the recommendations that I saw in reading this paper, the framework that's presented here, looking at the specific roles of social media misinformation, the different biases that it plugs into, how it, the different factors that make it more or less resonant, is a really useful framework for any of us that are working on atrocity prevention. It helps us think about contextual features and I would say that this is a starting point that I take away from this, and from the work that I've done in this space, that I think is really essential, is that if we're working in a context, which is pretty much anywhere now where social media exists, and where communication exists, so this is maybe my own bias here, looking at the relationship between communication and conflict, the part of our analysis, our risk assessment, and our assessment of what might happen and what we need to be concerned about, what we need to be prepared for, and what prevention might look like, I think really needs to include this analysis of the role of social media and the role of different information communication technologies in the ecosystem at play. And I think this framework that's presented in this paper is actually really helpful to enable us to do this. So for example, one thing that I think can be pulled out from a few of the different sections is that social media platforms, as they are, one of the affordances that they give is that they can help groups overcome collective action problems, right? So because of the new capacity and anonymity that's enabled with social media, because you can find and create a sense of belonging in online spaces, because you can have a level of media segmentation and sort of the ability to control perceptions within a group that you have consistent access to, this can help groups that are in some ways counter-normative or countercultural overcome collective action problems. I would imagine this is particularly important in somewhat stable or recently stable democracies, where you have sort of spoilers in the system that might be otherwise sort of tamped down or controlled and restrained by the systems in place, but are able to overcome their own collective action problem through finding each other online. That might be a little bit less relevant or differently relevant under an authoritarian regime, where maybe, depending on what technologies are available, you have more resistance actors, or in a, we talked about the ability for anonymous peace building action to be taken in high risk environments, or to build that type of capacity through closed social media groups. So looking at things like the ability of a new technology to overcome a certain set of social media technology to overcome collective action problems with the use of misinformation for bad actors, but how this can also be used in a positive sense, feels like a really important thing to analyze. And looking, just knowing that anywhere that we're really operating now, we should be looking at social media misinformation as a risk factor. I just think that this provides us a framework to start to analyze how might that play out in this context, in a context where we are concerned about the level of division that's happening, where we are concerned because there's a recent outbreak of conflict. I think this gives us a path to say specifically, this is exactly what we might be worried about with social media misinformation. These are our different scenarios, and here's what we can think. So I think that that's something that anyone can run with and do with this paper. And I also really appreciate that it speaks to the differences of how this plays out under different regime types. And I think that that's really essential for us to look at, especially as longtime stable democracies become less stable, in part aided by this type of social media misinformation. How do we look at interventions across that spectrum, and specifically, what is the role of social media misinformation under different regime types? How does that feed into our analysis of atrocity risk and our framework for assessing a context and enabling us to think about what that can happen? So I think that's one thing that comes up for me in reading. And the most of what I wanted to speak to briefly today is really about what this means for what can be done. And this comes back to that starting point. I think that at this point, to responsibly engage and intervene in a context, we do need to understand this landscape of information, and social media misinformation in particular, which we know can be all of the factors outlined in this paper and from this research show us that in at-risk context for mass atrocity, for political instability, social media misinformation will find a stronger foothold due to the dynamics at play. I think one of the things that feels really important to me and that I've seen across work, and you mentioned in this presentation, the differences between Facebook and Twitter and Gab or Telegram. These platforms are also used in different ways by would-be violent actors. So I think that an important point of analysis is to understand what are the different forms of social media that exist in a context that we're operating in, and how are they interacting with each other and with more mainstream forms of media and more mainstream actors. So for example, what is the role of Facebook versus public speeches from political leaders? How is that engaging? We might see things that are reshared that are quotes from political leaders. That's misinformation that actually originates from a key actor in a public forum, but gets repeated in the online space. And we might see the opposite. What is the role? What's the relationship between that and a Viber or a Telegram or WhatsApp, some of these more closed messaging groups with various degrees of security? How are groups operating across platforms, right? How are they moving from Facebook into a closed WhatsApp group? What are people doing on these different platforms, right? I think we might see closed messaging apps and things like that being more used to plan action, and then other platforms used to set a narrative and drive a permissive environment for that action, such as Facebook or Twitter. So really asking ourselves, what are the specific uses in this context of the different platforms that exist, and how do they fit together, and how are they interacting with and plugging into some of the more traditional news media sources, as well as offline infrastructure for action, right? Whether that's offline meetings that are happening or forums in particular spaces. Understanding that full spectrum is going to be really essential to understand how to intervene in what are incredibly now complicated, complex media environments. And again, rife with this type of misinformation, but it's not just living on one platform because we see it there. How is it traveling across different platforms, and how is it translating into offline action? Become really critical questions for us. The other thing, another thing in reading through this and looking through some of the different recommendations for civil society and others that this brings up is, I think, a really important question for us to think about, which is this sort of internal external action. So what can really be done specifically by actors that are in a country? And this kind of taps to some of the conversation at the beginning of different key phrases and how they morph over time and things like that. And you really need that on the ground knowledge of how things are unfolding, and someone that's really embedded in a context to do that. And in an environment where we see this, I like how you phrase it, the crisis of epistemic authority and trust and chaos amidst this fraying of in-group, out-group, and all of that, I think it's really essential that we think about what type of trust and infrastructure that need to be built as incredibly valuable resources in this type of media environment, and specifically with the use of social media misinformation. So what does it look like to build trust so that in that epistemic crisis, or in that sense of chaos, or as things are sort of pulling apart, there are a set of actors and messengers or institutions that people do still trust and look to as trusted voices, and that generally needs to be built within a context and be supported. So that's really very much supporting local actors and local civil society. And what does the infrastructure look like to get content out? So it's not just in the face of the type of social media misinformation and the speed and all of this, what is the structure that can deliver content to people on a consistent, engaged basis in real time at a fast pace as events are unfolding? So I think we really have to be looking at what needs to be built internally to a context that is going to provide that level of trust for engagement, as well as infrastructure for engagement that can evolve and adapt in real time. And how can, where we're seeing things like disincentives for opposing voices to speak out, which is something you talk to in the paper, and how misinformation can be used towards that end. How are we supporting local actors to overcome that collective action problem? At the same time, that I think that this means that we really need to focus on localized infrastructure that reaches across these different types of platforms with trusted voices, and think about building that credibility. I think this can be a bit of a downstream intervention, but this is one that matters upstream. The more, the better, right? So I think this is something we can look at. But I think it also gives us an interesting opportunity to wrestle with how we see the role of external engagement. Obviously there are a lot of external or foreign actors to different contexts that are engaged in spreading misinformation and stoking misinformation in contexts that are not their own. So communities like the groups on this call that are sitting in in some of these more multilateral or governmental or international spaces, but working across contexts, what then becomes the role of our sector as a set of external actors? So to put a finer point on it, where you see sort of, for example, Russian disinformation, one of the things that happens is the barrier to entry to either stoke misinformation or counter it is a lot lower, because you just need to be on the platform, you need to have the language, you need to set it up. And obviously that's been very abused by bad actors with coordinated misinformation campaigns. The question is for other external actors that are working on things like atrocity prevention, where do we see ethical boundaries there? Where do we see our role in helping people overcome collective action problems if they're being dissuaded from speaking out and potentially facing consequences in their own country? I think there's a whole set of questions here that do involve ethical and normative questions for our space, but that are worth wrestling with when we think about that information environment and that internal external. Relatedly, I think that another thing that comes up to my mind for government and multilaterals and funders is how are we in areas where there are investments in, for example, increasing infrastructure and connectivity, how are there concurrent investments being made in building capability of local civil society actors to deal with what we know are the risks of social media misinformation that come alongside that? So obviously there's connectivity over much of the world right now, but there are still investments to increase levels of connectivity in different countries. And how can there be a risk analysis alongside that of some of the impact that this might have on the context, taking into account the framework that's provided in this paper that would let us ask what a concurrent investment might look like as sort of a socially responsible, looking at some of the potential negative externalities of investment in greater connectivity that could enable this type of social media misinformation. On the question of social media companies, I just wanted to offer here that I think that there is this content moderation question, which brings up a lot of questions and concerns and free speech and rights. But I think that often I have seen social media companies use the question of content moderation and free speech considerations as a way to duck out of the real issue, which is their algorithms. And it's a really easy out for them to say, sorry, we can't do much, free speech, human rights, etc. And the truth is that it's not just about takedowns and content moderations. It's very much that these are not unbiased spaces. They are writing algorithms. The intent is not to sow conflict. The intent is to make money. But because of a lot of the biases outlined in this paper, there are structural reasons that these platforms are contributing so extensively to these risks. And so thinking about how do we have this conversation and put pressure in a way that takes into account some of the content moderation that does exist and is critical, and things like protecting local content moderators, but also doesn't let the content moderation become a distraction from actually thinking about some of the more algorithmic challenges. And all of this is challenging because we don't have enough data and information about what's actually going on in these platforms, because they own that data and they often provide it to researchers, but with caveats that they still own the data. So I think there's that transparency issue I just want to drive home is really important for us to even understand and be able to have a conversation that goes deeper on some of the structural issues with the platforms. And then the last thing I just want to put out to this group is that I think the note that Christina, you ended on is so important, that this is very much a multi-stakeholder issue, and we need so many different types of knowledge and expertise, from people who understand how our brains work, to knowledge of a particular context, to knowledge of how the platforms work, and all the stakeholders from government to civil society. And I want to point out that technology is not static. It is continuing to change. And so we're dealing with social media as we see it now. And I would say we're a little bit on the back foot in that we're trying to catch up. And so that's a priority. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there. But I think that we would be well served to make some investment of at least thinking and discussions in looking at what's coming down the pipeline, and using frameworks like what we have in this paper that tells us what are the specific affordances of social media, what are the specific impacts of social media misinformation on a conflict context, and the factors that increase its resonance, like some of the socio-political, socio-psychological factors. How do these need to be updated, or how do they shift as new social media and social media related tools arise? So deepfakes is an obvious one. This, of course, will tap right into that sense of chaos and epistemic crisis. How do we prepare for that and use what we learned from this framework and think what factors might become even more important, what else might spin out from that? Looking further down the pipeline, VR, if we get virtual reality that's integrated into these types of social media connectivity, where people how does that shift to an even greater degree the sense of belonging that people can find in groups and the ability for transnational organizing around in-group identity and affirmation. So, and so I think that it will serve us well to not just wait for those tools to arrive and be abused by bad actors who tend to be early adapters of new technologies often, but to actually use this type of framework that we have here with the focus on the misinformation, the way that it can fuel mass atrocities, and think about how the things that are coming down the pipeline use that as a tool for analysis and assessment, and to be a little bit prepared for what's continuing to come at us. So thank you for inviting me to be a discussant. I found this, again, to be a really, really fantastic paper and really important for the field.
Thank you, Rachel. That was just wonderful. If I can take the prerogative of the chair to put a question to all three of you. Where do you think at this point, in your heads at least, where does the balance lie between sort of free speech and moderation? Do you have sort of a formula in your head about how you would strike that balance, and what kind of legislation might be appropriate?
I'll jump in with a really tough question. Thanks, Jim. And also thank you, Rachel, for those incredibly helpful comments and just for bringing your expertise to this discussion. I wanted to say thank you. That's a tough question. And the reason I want to jump in is because I'm a trained anthropologist. And so part of the way that I begin to think about that is to think about what balance might make sense for individual societies, because I think the context might be a little bit different there. And it might be related to, for example, if you are an early transitional justice context. I mean, Ernesto is an expert in those types of contexts, but that might look very different than if you are a society that has not had a recent history of violence or questions like that. So then the question becomes, A, how do you know what society feels is appropriate? B, there are questions there about, collective society anticipating some of these challenges and being savvy about them. So Estonia does a lot of public, they treat cybersecurity as kind of a public hygiene model. So, but that's a country that does a lot with public education about cyber threats or hybrid warfare and things like that, social media, but not every country does that. So then what makes sense to that society? Is society sort of tracking these issues and the harm that could cause it? And then also, I think the bigger issue though that Jim is raising is that we're talking about recommendations to not only governments and multilaterals. So these kind of consistent standards in international law or multilateral organizations that reach across cultures and contexts. I mean, I understand the rub there. I don't have an easy question, but had to start off with just saying that balance is going to be a little bit different for different societies, in my view.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much, Rachel. These comments are absolutely fantastic. And I just kind of want to spend the rest of the time just talking about all the fascinating points you raised. But just to pivot to Jim very quickly, I agree with Christina. I think that part of it depends on the particular level of fragility or the context of the society. And I don't mean to kind of punt it to the abstract, but I think that there isn't one standard across the board. I do think that the new EU legislation, the Digital Services Act, which we'll see how it actually unfolds and the efficacy of it. But one thing that it's actually trying to do is it's trying to create real rigorous standards for tech companies to share data with researchers and human rights researchers and possibly even journalists. That's a little unclear right now. But it's a way of thinking about identifying general trends of how disinformation and misinformation operate and how they unfold. Because exactly as Rachel was saying, one of the things that happens is that big tech corporations actually don't share their data consistently. And when they do, they take it back. So we should be careful of thinking about very specific incidences or episodes of disinformation or misinformation, and also think about the broader trends, how these things unfold, how they resonate, what are the major nodes that amplify these questions. And we still don't have a really good understanding of that. And that's partly because these large corporations don't share their data. Or when they do share their data, there's all sorts of caveats attached to it. Or in the case of Facebook Meta, for instance, recently they've weakened one of the main tools, CrowdTangle, for instance. There's all of these ways in which it really undermines the ability of researchers to really understand the full scale or the full scope of what's happening beyond the really high profile incidences, kind of the iceberg above the water level. As far as to your question, though, I think it's a really profound question, because I also don't want to be someone who essentially comes in a way and says, well, the government always knows what's best. The government should be in a position where it can regulate. And it can step in on some of these really profound and divisive questions. Sometimes divisive and fringe actors are at the forefront of pushing for social change in a positive way. We have a long, we don't have to go through examples of this, but we know this. So we shouldn't assume that somehow the middle political position is necessarily always normatively the best position. So there are really kind of profound challenges involved in all of this. I do think that the case that Christina was talking about kind of approaching this as a public hygiene question, it's worthwhile thinking of it this way from a policy perspective, and it also brings in social scientists. I think that's really important. The last thing I'll say is that social psychologists in particular have consistently found that the way you respond to these questions effectively is not by just showing that these are lies and give more information on the truth, right? That sometimes exposing the falsehood of disinformation, misinformation campaigns to people who are already receptive to it isn't going to change their minds. There's a deeper kind of question here, which addresses all of the issues I was talking about earlier about intelligibility and belonging and the biases. There's a social psychological series of challenges, that is, they're not merely epistemic truth claim problems, if that makes sense. So if we think of it that way, then we can think a little bit more broadly about how to kind of cultivate communities and publics that are more informed and a little bit more critical of the kind of information they might get. They might know how to kind of read it in a more sophisticated way. I suspect, Rachel, you have a lot to say on this as well.
I have thoughts, but I would say a large part of me wants to evade that question the same way I did in my remarks and say that I really do think, we have to have the content conversation. But I think almost more importantly with social media platforms really is this structure conversation. So I won't fully evade your question. I think that there's some really interesting foundational questions there. Are platforms the public square? Right? So if we talk about free speech, you have the ability, the freedom to express yourself, but where? Are platforms private companies, or are they the public square, or where do they fall? And I think that's a really important thing for us to answer. Platforms do have their own rules, right, that are different from governments. They have their community standards, and often they're falling short of actually enforcing their own community standards, and they're not writing into their cost of doing business, hiring content moderators that speak a local language, taking care of those content moderators, being able to even live up to the standards that they set for themselves. I don't have a special formula for you, Jim, on what is free speech, what should or shouldn't be protected. I think there's a lot of frameworks that can help us, from some of these international guiding documents to the dangerous speech work and all of that. But I think there's also a question, I've heard it framed a lot as sort of freedom of speech versus freedom of reach. And I do think that with these platforms, it's not just that the content is out there. It's the way that it's getting reached. It's that we do know from some of the research that things like fear and novelty spread faster. We know that that these algorithms are written to give people more of what they like, right? And so that it drives people often towards these deeper and deeper into sort of rabbit holes when they start off on a harmful path. And I will emphasize again the importance of some level of transparency and information. We get it through leaks, and when there are leaks that are coming out of these companies, we're finding out what they know about the level of harms. And it's not just about the content being out there, it's about the eyeballs on that content, and it's about the way that it's getting promoted and through these different algorithms, and the way that once somebody engages with one piece of content, they're taking further and further and further on that pathway. So I do think that what we have here is a really structural question that we're not we've just begun to scrape the surface on understanding how that actually operates. And to me, that's the really meaningful area for intervention, because I think as long as our point of intervention is asking either governments or these platforms to moderate speech, it is really, really tricky. And some of it's, even the reach stuff is tricky. Are you slowing down certain content? Does that privilege certain voices over another? But we have to, I think, recognize that our starting point isn't just some unbiased public square that anyone can show up in. It is it is already a biased platform in that it's privileging certain content over others and driving it, and in some ways giving in-kind support to certain content. So Jim, I've dodged your question. I do agree, and would plus one to what Christina and Ernesto have said about that, that contextual awareness as well. And I would say to look at some of the tools and frameworks that we already have to think about free speech in general. And I also do think we should wrestle with that question. Like, how do we understand these platforms? Are they part of the public square or not? Are they some unique thing that's new that we need to grapple with? How we understand that is going to be really important, because it's going to impact what we think matters for moderation in some of these more democratic free spaces. But it also needs to work when we think about more authoritarian spaces, and there's a different set of risks.